The following program is a special presentation from Home Box Office.
In thousands of cities and towns all over America, as sure a sign of spring as the greening of the trees is the whistle of the calliope and the raspy voice of the barker, as the circus, the carnival, and the sideshow begin another season. Tonight I'm going to take you back over 100 years to the days of P.T. Barnum, his sideshow and his human oddities. I'm going to introduce you to some extraordinary people with extraordinary heroic stories to tell. Real people like you and me, but different. Very special people like Tom Thumb, who was only 25 inches tall, yet sang and danced so delightfully that he became the most beloved performer of his day. Cheng and Eng, so famous that all joined twins are called Siamese because of them. The beautiful Hilton sisters, who, though linked together like Cheng and Eng, charmed audiences with their lovely voices. The skeleton man, Pete Robinson, and the fat lady, Bunny Smith, who proved love conquers all. Robert Wadlow, almost 9 feet tall, the tallest man who ever lived. John Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, so monstrous looking he had to hide his face behind a mask. And finally, Julia Pastrana, whose voice and story continues to fascinate and touch us 100 years after her death. It's been said there is a quality of legend about the people you're about to meet. They're like characters in a fairy tale who triumph over disasters that would defeat most of us. Well, these stories may sound like fairy tales, but every one of them is true. Stranger than fiction is the story of Robert Wadlow, who was born in Alton, Illinois in 1918. At first, there was absolutely no indication that he was fated to become the tallest man that ever lived. By the time he was 10, he was 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 210 pounds. When Robert was 13, he joined the Boy Scouts. At 7 feet 4 inches tall, he was not only the tallest Boy Scout in the world, but one of the world's tallest human beings. More than anything, he wanted to be like other boys. He wanted to go to college to become a lawyer. By the time he had graduated from high school, he was 8 feet 3 1/2 inches tall and still growing. He was determined to carry out his plan of becoming a lawyer, and he entered college. By now, he weighed over 400 pounds, and his bones were fragile. College was becoming impossible. An ordinary chair would not hold him. He had trouble handling an ordinary-sized fountain pen. Getting to class in time from one building to another was a problem. In winter, with ice on the ground, the walking was especially risky. Because of these insurmountable difficulties, Wadlow left college, but he remained determined to make his own way. Because of his 37 AA shoe size, he was a natural for a promotional campaign for the Peters Shoe Company of St. Louis. He seized on the idea of having a shoe store of his own. To raise money for it, he and his father made appearances with the circus. Even though he knew he was a human oddity, he had an innate sense of dignity. The circus wanted him to dress up in a costume that would exaggerate his height. He refused and wore an ordinary business suit. He was as kind as he was tall, and the people loved him. On his 21st birthday, he measured over 8 feet 11 inches, almost 9 feet, and he was still growing. He prayed for it to stop. His legs began to give way, so he had to use a cane in order to walk. Because of Wadlow's rapid growth, it was hard for him to feel what was happening in his extremities. In 1940, he was wearing a brace to strengthen a weak ankle. The brace hadn't been fitted correctly, and it rubbed the ankle raw, causing an infection. It was only discovered when he began to run a high fever, and by then, it was too late. Robert Wadlow, the tallest man in medical history, died of an infection at the age of 22. Robert Wadlow's enormous height had been caused by an abnormal pituitary gland. Today, doctors might be able to help someone like Robert, but 40 years ago, his tragic end was inevitable. It was once also inevitable that twins linked together were joined for life. Thanks to the advances of medical science, Siamese twins are a thing of the past. Like normal identical twins, they are products of a fertilized egg that divides in two. Only in the case of Siamese twins, the division isn't complete. They are born joined together. Since the 1950s, surgeons have been able to separate them successfully. This operation wasn't possible in the case of Cheng and Eng. Born in Siam in 1811, they were the most famous Siamese twins that ever lived. The band that tied them together was 5 inches long and as thick as a forearm. An artery ran through it, linking their circulatory systems. When Cheng and Eng were in their teens, they were brought to the United States and became overnight celebrities. Their fame spread worldwide. Onlookers would pay any price to see them, and the money rolled in. The twins had saved $60,000, a fortune in those days. They bought land in Wilkesboro, built a house, and at the age of 29 settled down to become farmers. The North Carolina legislature passed an act making them honorary citizens. They had no family name, so they adopted the name of a friend and became Cheng and Eng Bunker. At a farmer's wedding, the twins met 19-year-old Sally and her sister, 20-year-old Adelaide Yates. They courted them and proposed marriage. Before they married, Cheng and Eng wanted an operation to separate them. The sisters, fearing their possible death, pleaded with them not to attempt it. We want you as you are, alive, not dead. They married and built 2 separate homes, one for each family. The twins spent 3 days in one house, the next 3 days in the other. The following year, each bride gave birth to a baby daughter, one within a week of the other. The families kept growing. Their children were attractive and intelligent and went on to lead normal lives and have normal families. In time, the twins had between them 21 children. Today, there are close to 1,000 living descendants scattered over the United States. Cheng and Eng led happy, fulfilled lives. That wasn't true of Daisy and Violet Hilton, the most successful and certainly the most beautiful of the Siamese twins. Born in England in 1908, they were literally sold into slavery by their mother when they were 2 weeks old. They were joined at the spine and considered rare attractions. By the age of 3, they were being exhibited in sideshows. They learned to become entertainers and were so successful that they were earning $5,000 a week in nightclubs and vaudeville before they were 21 years old.
Keep one sweetheart on your mind, the kind that say they don't fall far. you'll never, never, no, never, 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 no, never, never, never say you'll never fall in love.
They tried to lead normal lives. They fell in love. Violet became engaged to Maurice Lambert. They were denied a marriage license in 21 states because they were told it would be contrary to morals and public policy.
I am Violet Hilton. This is my prospective bridegroom, Maurice Lambert. We tried very hard to procure a marriage license, both in the states of New York and New Jersey, but were refused in both places. I feel very unhappy about it because I love Maurice very, very dearly, and he loves me. And I don't see any reason in the world why we should be denied the pleasure of being happy. My sister Daisy feels the same way about it, and she too wants me to be happy.
Their dreams of a happy marriage were never fulfilled. At the height of their career, they starred in a movie called Chained for Life. This scene closely paralleled the frustration and tragedy of their own lives.
I can't go on. Don't you think I know how you feel? I wanted love too. All our lives, we've had to bury every normal emotion. I'm not a machine, I'm a woman. I should have the right to live like one. We've always said we were like other people, yet different.
Ironically, the film that was the highlight of their career marked the end of their fame as show business attractions. The harsh reality of the film proved too much for the audience to bear. The audience could no longer enjoy their talents and not be aware of the twins' suffering.
Free? But we've always been together. And we'll be that way forever.
Toward the end of their lives, they left show business, ran a hotel for a while, and then wound up as checkers in a supermarket in Charlotte, North Carolina. They died in 1969 of complications of the Hong Kong flu. It was ironic that they ended their lives in North Carolina, the same state that welcomed their famous counterparts, Cheng and Eng. Cheng and Eng were different from other people from the moment they were born. Others, like Tom Thumb and Robert Wadlow, were perfectly normal at birth. That was also certainly true of Robert Earl Hughes, who, according to medical record, was the heaviest man who ever lived. Robert was a big baby when he was born in 1926 in Illinois. 11.5 pounds, but babies that size are not so uncommon. A seizure of whooping cough disturbed his endocrine balance. He began to gain weight, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. By the age of 18, he weighed 693 pounds. At 25, 896, and he was getting heavier. What can someone that heavy do for a living? As a youngster, the huge boy worked on a farm, but he quickly became too heavy and slow. Still, he wanted to earn his own way, to live like other people. Only the sideshow would have him, and they paid him well. To travel to fairs and carnivals, he needed his own special van, built on a trailer truck, with specially built chairs, a special bed. Ordinary ones wouldn't hold him. At 32, he weighed 1,069 pounds. He measured 122 inches around the waist, 124 inches around the chest, and 40 inches around the upper arm. Almost any activity made his heart pound. Any illness would have serious complications. In the end, it was just a run-of-the-mill disease that killed him. In 1958, he died of complications caused by catching measles. Thousands of people came to bid him farewell. The Quincy Herald-Whig reported, "Thus ended the funeral of a big man, big in size and big in heart." Everyone who knew Robert Earl Hughes remarked that despite his personal tragedy, he never failed to be concerned for other people. He was always remarkably cheerful. That ability to defy the odds and be happy is typical of these special people. was certainly true of Pete Robinson. He was also big in heart, but no one could ever call Pete big in size. Pete Robinson was known as the living skeleton. No matter how much food Pete ate, he never could put on weight. So he took advantage of his unique appearance and became an accomplished, eccentric dancer. He weighed just 58 pounds, a wisp of a man. His sweetheart, Bunny Smith, at 467 pounds, was 8 times his weight. Their act caught the imagination of the public. Everyone came to see the world's thinnest man court the country's fattest lady. Ironically, their act became a reality when Pete fell in love. Pete was so light, a strong wind could blow him over. No doctor could help him, but Pete thought Bunny's love would. At first she resisted. For 8 years he courted her, at sideshows where they worked together in Coney Island, at carnivals, or on the road with the circus. Finally, on the 9th year, 1924, 468-pound Bunny said yes to 58-pound Pete. The circus celebrated their wedding with gala rites at Madison Square Garden. It was also a celebration of love and courage. Pete and Bunny went waltzing happily through life together, just like other people, if they're lucky. Even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. So goes the ancient proverb that through magic or witchcraft, men can turn themselves into beasts.
A few moments ago, Pietro was a man, a harmless, good-natured man. Look at him now. He's no longer human. He's a wolf, snarling, ferocious, lusting for the kill. You're looking at a scientific miracle, gentlemen.
Religion exists in every country, in every culture. During the centuries of witch persecution, this phenomenon was seen as simply another activity of the devil, transforming himself into a wolf, ranging the countryside at night and terrorizing the people. The bite of the werewolf turned the bitten one into another demon, doomed to eternal life of murder at the full moon. It was thought the only way a werewolf could be killed was by a silver bullet. Do these legends come from out of the dark, buried fears of our subconscious? Do we fear that our link to animals is more fragile than we think? The literal werewolf does not exist. It is only a myth, only a creature of the mind. Or is he? It is claimed these myths were inspired by actual human beings, like these, documented by 16th century Austrian paintings. And later, in the 19th century, by Mung Foset of Ceylon and the Vauxhall family of Burma. In the beginning, I said there was a quality of legend about these people, like characters in fairy tales. This was especially true of Lionel, the Lion Man, who looked as if he'd stepped out of the tale of Beauty and the Beast. Lionel's real name was Stefan Bebrowski. He was born in Poland in 1890. Every inch of his body was covered with thick hair. Lionel looked so frightening that when he went out in the street, he had to hide behind a veil. In the early 1900s, he became a consummate circus performer. He was soon making $500 a week. That was a lot of money when we consider $9 could buy a man's suit in those days. His act combined fact and fiction. He gave the audience what it wanted. though he trained himself as an expert gymnast, the audience was too mesmerized by the sight of him to fully appreciate his talent. So Lionel devised a story to explain his extraordinary appearance.
It is a curious story, a sad story, how I got this way.
Lionel claimed that while his mother was pregnant, she saw his father mauled by a lion in a circus. He maintained that his mother's fright at what the lion had done affected his birth and cursed him for life. The audience was more than willing to believe this strange tale. Now, of course, Lionel's story about his father wasn't true, but he had to make up something to conform to the popular Victorian belief that when a woman was pregnant, her baby could be permanently marked by a frightening experience. We all know that modern medical science doesn't support such an idea at all. But what caused Lionel's condition then? Probably a spontaneous change in his genes that affected both his hair and his teeth. Something like that happened to another incredible human oddity, Julia Pastrana, who was known as the Ape Woman. P.T. Barnum thought she was the ugliest woman he had ever seen. But she could speak 3 languages and could sing and dance with rare talent. Julia Pastrana was a Mexican Indian under contract to an American showman named Lent. From the moment he first saw her, he schemed of different ways to exploit his rare find. Julia was a sensation all over the United States and Canada. Scientists examined her. Some thought she belonged to a new species, but most agreed she was human and very much a woman. Lent, her manager, took her to England, to France, to Germany, and as her fame grew, Lent began to worry. He thought other showmen were trying to lure her away from him. Marriage offered a sure way for him to hold on to her. He proposed, and she accepted. "He loves me for myself alone," she said on the morning of her wedding. In 1860, Lent and Julia arrived in Moscow to await the birth of their first child. Julia was happier than she had ever been. She had a husband, and now she was to have a child of her own, just like other people. Julia prayed the baby would be normal. But when the nurse held out her infant son, she saw a hairy, dark-skinned little creature that looked just like herself. 36 hours after its birth, the baby was dead. Broken-hearted, Julia died a few days later at the age of 28. Lent was desperate to preserve the source of his fortune. He went to Moscow University to see Professor Sokolov, an expert at mummification. Sokolov preserved the bodies of Julia and her son. For 20 years, Lent traveled with the mummified remains of Julia and her son, exhibiting them and making money.
She is Darwin's famous missing link.
P.T. Barnum saw Lent's exhibition and was struck by a deep sympathy for the dead woman. He said, "Poor Julia could not know an old friend was calling. She could not hear or see, feel joy or pain or want of love. And I thought how once she said, "He loves me for myself alone." Most people called her a monster. I knew who the real monster was. In 1880, Lent went insane. He died soon afterwards in an asylum, completely mad. Other showmen bought the exhibit and continued to exploit Julia. 100 years later, the bodies of Julia and her son were still being exhibited. In 1972, they toured the United States. People saw them at fairs across the country. In 1973, they were in Sweden and in Norway. Where they are today, no one knows. Perhaps the most appealing of all human oddities is the midget. Midgets and dwarfs have always fascinated us. In every part of the world, myths have sprung up about them. In Europe, dwarfs were creatures of magic and mystery, possessed of supernatural powers. They were called elves, goblins, pixies, brownies, leprechauns. Celebrated in many times and places, little people have been favorites of kings and queens. Jeffrey Hudson was only 18 inches tall, yet served as a diplomatic courier, killed a man in a duel, and had numerous love affairs. Count Borolaski made his living as a musician in the courts of Europe until he died in 1837 at the age of 98. Laia Graf, 27 inches tall, became famous when she was photographed with J.P. Morgan. Like so many other little people, Laia Graf was killed in Auschwitz in 1941. Mexican-born Lucia Zarate, the smallest woman who ever lived. Under 20 inches tall, she weighed only 5 pounds. Charles Stratton, known as Tom Thumb, was not only the smallest man who ever lived, but he was certainly the most famous. Some of his fame was due to his careful exploitation by the self-styled King of the Humbugs, P.T. Barnum.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
From the beginning, Barnum was destined to play a key role in the life of the most celebrated human oddity of all time, General Tom Thumb.
Sprightly, perfectly symmetrical in all his proportions, and graceful beyond belief, weighing just 15 pounds and standing 25 inches tall.
Tom Thumb was born in 1838. His mother and father were completely normal in height, and so were his 2 older sisters. So was a brother who was born later. So was Tom at first, but when he was still an infant, he stopped growing. 2 years later, the child was still only as high as your knee. In 1842, P.T. Barnum, visiting Bridgeport, met Tom, who was 5 years old. Barnum trained him to sing, to dance, to joke with an audience. A bond grew between the two, a bond that was to last over 40 years. Tom Thumb was an instant success. In city after city, he played to packed houses, and the dollars flowed in. He became a household word throughout the country. In 1844, Barnum, looking for new worlds to conquer, set sail for Europe. In London, Tom opened at a top showplace, the Egyptian Hall, and was invited to appear before the young queen. Tom Thumb sang and danced his way into Victoria's heart. She invited him to Buckingham Palace again and again, showering him with gifts and Barnum with gold. Songs were written about him. Statues of him appeared in shop windows. His portrait was painted. Children played with Tom Thumb dolls. He rode about in a tiny coach made by the Queen's own coachmaker. Life seemed to have given the miniature man everything he could want, except someone to share it with him. 21-year-old Lavinia Warren seemed to be that someone. She was 32 inches tall, weighed 29 pounds, and was very beautiful. It was at Barnum's American Museum that Tom Thumb saw her and fell in love.
Beautiful dreamer, wake unto me. Starlight and dewdrops are waiting for thee. Sounds of the rude world heard in the day, lulled by the moonlight, have all passed away. Beautiful dreamer.
Tom watched from the wings at every performance. Even though he had a rival for her affection, he was determined to make her his wife. After a few months of courtship, Tom proposed to her and she accepted. Their approaching marriage became the topic of the day. Barnum, the master showman, took charge. He invited several thousand guests, generals, admirals, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts. On February 10th, 1863, they were married at Grace Church in New York. President Lincoln gave them a reception at the White House. Lavinia couldn't have had a better, more loving husband. Even though, to their sorrow, they never had a child, they lived happily together until Tom's untimely death from a stroke in 1883 at the age of 45. Lavinia lived on until she was 78 years old. To the end of her life, she wore a picture of Tom Thumb in a locket around her neck. Although Lavinia had married again, she wanted to be buried close to Tom. Her headstone says only a single word: wife. In life, most people dread the trauma of being different. Freaks come into the world different. And if they make their peace with their tragedy, they become extraordinary people. Extraordinary is the word for another human oddity known as the Elephant Man. His real name was John Merrick. Merrick's story has fascinated millions of people the world over. It has been the subject of a number of books, a celebrated play and a motion picture, which were all inspired from an account published in 1924 by Sir Frederick Treves. The Elephant Man was being exhibited in an empty shop by a showman by the name of Tom Norman, who hoped to make a fortune with him. When Treves saw the Elephant Man, he immediately recognized he had found a medical phenomenon. He asked that he be brought to his office at London Hospital, where he was lecturing in anatomy. Treves had given Merrick his card and had arranged to have him admitted in secret. Merrick came to him that night. The Elephant Man had to use a disguise so he would not be mobbed by the crowd and seized by the police. He was, in fact, wrote Treves, as secluded from the world as the man in the iron mask. Even though Treves was an eminent pathologist, he had never seen as bizarre a case as Merrick. His scientific curiosity aroused, he proceeded to examine him and photograph him for the Pathological Society of London. These are the actual photographs he took. Treves said he was the most pathetic specimen of humanity he had ever seen. That his sole idea was to creep into the dark and hide. He had no past to look back on, no future to look forward to. At the age of 21, he was a creature without hope. Treves couldn't help him medically, and he didn't have the authority to take him in as a charity case. Merrick had no choice. He went back to his bleak life with the showman. It was 2 years before Treves was destined to meet Merrick again. Abandoned by the showman, helpless and penniless, he was rescued by the police from a threatening mob. He asked to be brought to Dr. Treves. a miracle happened. Treves now had a superior position and was able to persuade the hospital to give him 2 rooms in which Merrick could live. Treves discovered that Merrick's grotesque body concealed an intelligent, sensitive human being. Treves became determined to introduce Merrick to men and women who would treat him as a normal, intelligent man and not as a monster of deformity. He asked a friend if she thought she could enter his room with a smile, wish him good morning, and shake him by the hand. Merrick was overwhelmed at the meeting. He said she was the first woman who had ever smiled at him, the first who had ever shaken his hand. Soon many people wanted to see him and greet him with a smile. He caught the fancy of Victorian society. Duchesses and countesses brought him presents. The Princess of Wales called on him and afterwards sent him a signed photograph. The last 5 years of his life were the happiest he had ever known. His life was cut short because of his determination to be like other people. Because of his enormous head, he was forced to sleep sitting up. One afternoon, he attempted to sleep prone, like other people, and dislocated his neck. He was found dead in bed of asphyxiation at the age of 28. Most people thought John Merrick was monstrous, but those who knew him felt if we could see his spirit, we would see the form of an upstanding, heroic man, smooth-browed, clean of limb, with eyes that flashed undaunted courage. All the people we've met, Tom Thumb, Julia Pastrana, Cheng and Eng, Robert Wadlow, John Merrick, Robert Earl Hughes, Bunny Smith and Pete Robinson, they all had the same undaunted courage. They met tragedy and fought it to a standstill. They took a handicap and turned it inside out, making it work for them. With courage and love, they built themselves a life.